Hello and welcome to The Icon. It's great to be back with you after a break over the summer, and we've got some exciting new content lined up for you. This time, we're going to talk to immigration barrister Colin Yeo about his book Welcome to Britain, which we really recommend checking out, link down in the description. And we're going to ask Colin some of our questions about immigration law and the world of immigration policy. So here's Colin.
My name's Colin Yeo. I'm a barrister. I've been working in immigration and asylum law for about 20 years now or something like that. I worked for a couple of charities, and for the last, I can't remember how long, sort of 15 years or so, I've been working as a barrister. I'm also the author of the book that we're talking about, Welcome to Britain, Fixing Our Broken Immigration System.
Hi, I'm Josh.
Hi, I'm Hannah.
We've dealt with terminology in one of our videos that we recorded. I wonder, the terms illegal, unauthorised and irregular immigrants, which term do you prefer and why?
Yeah, this is the fun bit, isn't it, where we're going through all the legal stuff. I'm not that hung up about terminology, and I think sometimes lawyers can be a little bit obsessed about the precise words that are used and so on. And I've got my preferences, but I'm not going to get down on somebody for using certain words if they're not technically speaking legally correct or whatever. Personally, when I'm talking about people who don't have permission to be in the country, I've started to use the word unauthorised. I think there are problems with calling somebody illegal because people aren't illegal, their actions might be, but people themselves aren't illegal. So that's a bit of a no-no. But at the same time, people know what that means. I prefer not to use that myself, but people know what it means. Other people talk about undocumented migrants, and I think that's a term that's particularly in widespread use in the United States. I don't like that term here in the context of the United Kingdom so much because there are a lot of people who are lawfully present as citizens or as long-term migrants and things like that who don't necessarily have the documents to prove it, but who aren't unauthorised or illegal or whatever you want to say. So I think there's a bit of a confusion potentially between somebody who's undocumented because they haven't applied for a passport yet, for example, they're a citizen but they just don't have documentary proof of it, or in our context the Windrush generation, they had lawful status, it was conferred legally by an act of parliament, but they weren't issued with documentary proof, and it's also been true of EU citizens because they didn't have to have documents to be in this country. So all those three groups you could describe as being undocumented, but they're not unauthorised or illegal in any way. They're legally resident in the United Kingdom.
So, in your book, you write that the Immigration Act of 1971 embodies a deliberate decision to confer huge power and responsibility on the shoulders of the Home Secretary alone. Can you tell us a bit more about what these powers are and what the implications of that is?
Yeah, so I'm contrasting the position in the UK with the position as I understand it in some other countries. So for example, in the United States, they've got statutes which set out what their immigration rules are, and those can only be amended with the permission of Congress, with the House of Representatives and the Senate, signed off by the President. Whereas in this country, our immigration laws are almost entirely controlled by the Home Secretary, who can change them whenever he or she wants, completely. We're expecting to have a completely new set of immigration rules in the next year or so, probably, which will be the first completely new set since, I think, 1994 or 1993, something like that. And there's a very limited, it's not going to say there's no procedure, it's not quite true, there's a very limited parliamentary procedure to go through where somebody can lodge an objection, in which case there may be a debate, but the debate takes place after the rules have come into force. And I think literally on 2 occasions, I think since 1971, there has been a debate, and it has very little impact. So basically there's one person can control all the rules, and that's a problem because it means that because they've got such absolute power, they don't really have to pay attention to anybody else. And it's really convenient. If you're the Home Secretary and you spot that there's a problem and you want to fix it, then it's really easy to do that. But it also means that you don't have to consult civil society groups, migrant groups, other government departments, or anybody basically. And they don't, basically. They just make the rules up as they choose, whenever they want, and change them all the time, which is a real problem in my view.
So in a publication in 2014, the think tank British Future recommended that, I quote, there should be an annual migration report to Parliament with an annual Migration Day report along the lines of the annual budget, where the Home Secretary reports clearly and transparently on all migration flows so that the House of Commons can debate the government's recommendations to maintain or amend its existing targets and its proposals for managing migration and integration impacts. I wonder, what is your view on this? Is this the way forward for accountability? And if not, what is?
I'm not sure that is such a great idea, personally. I mean, it's an interesting idea, and I think it perhaps dates back to the days of the net migration target and things like that. And I think the reason I don't think it's a great idea is that it assumes that migration is something that can be and should be managed, and I'm not sure that's necessarily true. There's a saying from it. There's a great charity called the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, JCWI, and they've got this saying: "People move, get over it." And there's an awful lot of truth to that, I think, when it comes down to it. And you can't, as the government's repeated failure year after year to meet the failure to meet the net migration target showed, you can't sort of manage the numbers that closely. I think you can set broad criteria, you can make things easier or harder to some limited extent, you can close routes and open routes and things like that. But the idea that you can manage migration that closely, I think has been proven over time to be untrue. At the same time, I would welcome the idea that we had a slightly more informed debate about immigration, and it'd be useful, for example, for parliamentarians to be looking at what makes up migrants to the UK, where that flow comes from, the number of refugees versus the number of work permit holders versus the number of family members and things like that. Because I get the feeling that a lot of members of the public and also a lot of parliamentarians just don't know those kind of basic figures. And so a bit more kind of awareness of things would, I think, be quite a useful thing for lawmakers.
Regarding deterrence strategies that are in place, in your book you write, there is no evidence, and there never has been any evidence, that the policies actually do deter immigration, but we do know that they genuinely cause disadvantage to those affected, often of a lasting nature. Can you explain a bit as to why those deterrence practices are so ineffective?
Yeah, I think it depends a bit on the context. So it depends which group of migrants you're talking about. So there's been a lot of attempts to deter refugees, for example, from coming to the UK. And basically, since the kind of late 90s, a fairly consistent set of policies has emerged where they're not allowed to claim welfare benefits, mainstream welfare benefits. They get subject to this kind of asylum support system where they're on basically destitution level support in really squalid accommodation, or more recently in barracks. And the idea is that we don't want the sort of mainstream welfare, which is not generous anyway, to act as some sort of magnet to draw people here or something like that. And again, the reason why they're not given the right to work while they're claiming asylum until they're recognised as refugees, or unless they're recognised as refugees, is because it's feared that giving people the right to work will act as what the government calls a pull factor and draw people into the UK. And that there's a range of different policies, like basically being horrible to people at the point at which they're asylum seekers before they become recognised as refugees. There's loads of policies designed to do that, but there's never been any evidence that it's ever put anybody off coming to the UK, partly because it ignores the things that people are fleeing. If people are really fleeing from persecution, then the fact that you're not going to get treated to fantastic welfare, or the welfare is quite as good as it used to be, or something like that, it is just a non-factor. It's not something that's going to be important to people. The reasons that people come to the UK to claim asylum are to do with our reputation in the world. They think that we're going to look after them and protect their human rights. We've often intervened in their countries. We're being presented as being sort of protectors of people. Also, they've got family members here. They already speak the language. They speak English and not French or German, for example, and all sorts of different reasons. And there's been quite a bit of research on this. And there's no evidence that treating them horribly when they get here is something that even gets communicated to the people who haven't come yet. So, there's no evidence that there's a mechanism by which it would deter people, and there's no evidence that it does actually deter people, and it ignores the kind of push factors, what you might call the push factors that drive people from their homes. And I think it's really important, before we move on from refugees, just to think that actually about maybe 60-70% of asylum seekers over the last year or two have ultimately ended up being recognised as refugees. And it's not an easy statistic to work out, because there's two stages. You get about half, maybe a little bit less than half, get asylum from the Home Office when they first ask for it, and you don't hear that in the media very often, or from the Home Office very often. But then another 10 to 20 percentage points of asylum seekers then ultimately win their appeals as well. And so another big chunk of people get asylum at the appeal stage. So it's a lot of people are actually being recognised as refugees, and they come from really dangerous countries where there are real problems, like Syria and Sudan and Eritrea, where their governments are definitely very repressive. And you can see that the composition of refugees changes depending on how badly people are being treated in these countries at different times. So that's refugees, but there's been this kind of move towards trying to deter all immigrants, I think, from wanting to come to the UK. And that's what we call the kind of hostile environment, which is partly just being nasty to people, treating them very unpleasantly, having very high immigration fees and so on, the kind of faceless bureaucracy and the hostility that they face. But there's also the sort of more technical sides of the hostile environment, which is this, not quite sure how to describe it, it's like third-party immigration controls. So the idea that immigration controls aren't just conducted at the border or even within the country by trained immigration officers, but you kind of pin a star on a bunch of employers and landlords and bank clerks and so on, and turn them into immigration deputies of some sort, and they have to check people's immigration status at hospitals, public services and so on. And the idea behind that was that it would discourage people from coming to the UK, or it encourages people to leave if they don't have lawful status anymore. But it's had all sorts of unintended side effects where, the Windrush scandal, because those people were undocumented, because they couldn't prove their status, they were caught out in it as well, and it had disastrous impacts on them.
And the government has proposed a new plan for immigration, which they laid out, at least the preliminary details of this year. What does this plan propose?
It's a slightly difficult question to answer because there's so little detail. So for 2 years now or something, however long Priti Patel has been Home Secretary, she's been talking about some major new piece of immigration legislation, and it's starting to feel a bit like the emperor has no clothes, because she's just, we don't know what's really being suggested. Now, the closest we know is this kind of idea that refugees seeking asylum in the UK would be removed from the UK when they get here, and they'd have their asylum claims considered in some other country. But there's just no way to do that. So, it's arguably in breach of the Refugee Convention, but I'm sure that doesn't bother the UK government, because the Refugee Convention isn't very easy to enforce, basically. It's in breach of existing domestic law, but you can change that if you're the government, so you can stop it from being unlawful by changing the law. But the biggest problem with that is that you've got to have another country that is willing to accept those refugees and process them there, and you've also got to be pretty sure that they're going to do it safely. Because if you start to think about it for a second, if you send those refugees to another country, they're not going to want to stay there. They're probably going to want to move somewhere else. So you're going to detain them. And what circumstances are you going to detain them in? Is it going to be in like a detention camp in the desert somewhere? What are the conditions going to be like? What are the guards going to be like? And there's a real danger of very serious human rights abuses taking place, as we've seen with a sort of equivalent system that the Australians have been using for the last few years. So that's the kind of vague idea of the legislation, but as far as we can see, it's completely impractical, because there is no country that would actually accept these asylum seekers at the moment, and if there was, then the risk of human rights breaches would be so great that it's a policy that might not last very long anyway. So it's kind of both impractical for now, but even if it does go ahead, it's a really dangerous and potentially, it's an immoral plan, frankly.
Found that interesting? Well, we've got loads more content coming your way, so why not help us get the word out? Give this video a like, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Until next time, bye for now.